Hey everyone. We've been having a fairly intense conference, and I think it's been lots of fun. I don't know if you've noticed, for those of you who have been here longer, that there's an interesting emphasis on that we're seeing more on the forms of cognition of non-humans, but also non-animals. In biosemiotics, we've always had this situation going on where we talk about, say, cellular cognition, but that doesn't really go too far because it's scary. We think that we have the tools to talk about that when we use biosemiotics. What we have are descriptive tools for thinking semiotically about different things that happen that we think are like meaning making. So, what we're going to be doing with my presentation, I should probably look at this one. That one is a bit too bright for me. Is we're going to be talking about meaning-making relations in natural environments and about scaffolding, which I'm pretty sure we've all talked about. We're all probably big fans of the concept of scaffolding, but also of something I want to call the scaffolding. And I'll talk about that in terms of natural disasters and environmental degradation in particular. Now, this is not too much about natural disasters, really. I'm using it more to illustrate a philosophical point that we may end up fighting about. So hopefully we will. It might be fun, but we'll see. So let's start with meaning making as a concept. But let me start with a fun story. Some of you already saw this presentation, so it's not going to be that fun. So feel free to nap through it. But I'm talking about you in particular. So um, this is from a winery in Chile, in central Chile. Let me just move this a little bit. Now, this is a very famous wine cellar in Chile. It's called Casillero del Diablo. You've probably heard of them because they were the main sponsors for Manchester United for a while. So they do have quite a bit of money. Um, but this is an old, it's a fairly old wine cellar. And it will sound a bit like an ad. It's not. I'm not. I wish I was being paid for telling you this dumb story, but I'm not, sadly. So in this place, in this wine cellar, because in the 19th century, the owners of the cellar had a big problem. People would go at night to steal the wine. People would just rob wine. You know, that's what you do when you live in the 19th century and you don't have money. You go and rob the wine that they have over there, right? Um, and the and this problem was fairly substantial for the owners of the wine cellar. So what they decided to do was to when the wine thieves would enter at night, they would start making lots of noises to scare them into thinking there was some sort of supernatural figure, to the point that they even made cutouts that would look just like this. That's why Casillero del Diablo means the locker of the devil or the cellar of the devil. So, of course, the wine thieves, being a superstitious bunch, would be scared of it. Now, I want us to reframe that story a little bit into let's try to formalize it into a series of arguments. First of all, because those of you who know me know that I love formalized arguments. It's very dear to my heart to just do this exercise. Wine thieves' environments includes non-physical entities. They themselves are committed to those non-physical entities, such as the devil. The devil, as a non-physical entity, becomes a physical entity in their environment. There we go. And the environment thus changes. And thus, finally, wine thieves stop stealing from the cellar. This apparently worked. I'm not sure to what degree it really did, but apparently it did work to the point that they ended up sponsoring Manchester United. So I suppose it did work to some degree. So this is a fairly simple story. There's nothing too strange, there's nothing mystical about what's going on, and we can frame it very fairly upon psychological concepts. I'm using this to illustrate a point, though. Because we have meaning making as our main operational concept, it would be very useful to try to narrow it in order to have it as a proper operative concept. So, with the example in the back of our minds, let's try to think of meaning as both a thing that is functional to an environmental theory and for it to have a sort of an explanatory role. Let me try to make sense of both of those things. If we want to say that our environments have some kind of meaningful relation, we need to make sense of what we mean by meaning. But if we are adding the fact that environments have some kind of meaningful relations, then that means that those meaningful relations have to cause something. They have to have some explanatory value. If they don't, then we really have no use for this theory, for semiotics in general. I think we all agree that it would be better to have semiotic theory than not to, right? Not only as a matter of principle, certainly, but also as a matter of principle. So my first contention, in order to at least give you my narrow view of what I mean by meaning and meaning making, is that meaning cannot be treated as equivalent to its material expression, first of all, not eliminable by reduction to its material interactions, and necessary for explanations of the behavior of organisms. I need to be committed to these 3 points in particular. These are 3 fairly important points, and I think that those are points that most of us commit to when we engage in biosemiotics, but sometimes we may not fully agree, and if you disagree, let me have it. There's also a couple of extra notes that meaning is transmitted and available to organisms, and meaning is also value laden for organisms. So this is basically the picture I have of what I want to say when I say meaning making, or at least to narrow it a little bit. We all know that talking about meaning making is a fairly complex affair. We don't have common definitions. Even technical definitions will not really fit everyone's bill. But I think this story is still more or less standard across biosemiotics. And it's more or less standard when we think about Hofmeyerian, not a word that we use too often, strangely enough, for semiotics. So we know the concept of scaffolding, and I don't have to remind you of it, but I will do it anyway because this is a presentation. So in the more mainstream form of biosemiotics, if there's such a thing, we are committed to a very specific kind of ontology. This is that even though signs are usually included in the ontology of biosemiotics, we don't really care so much, or I would contend we ought not to care about signs. And this is going to be a bit controversial, but I don't think that's really what matters at the end of the day. And I don't think that matters either for Hofmeyr. What matters really is the commitment to immaterial yet causally efficient entities of some sort, or causally efficient immaterial relations. That's a bit easier to sustain, but I will stick to the entities part. The caveat is that I don't think signs are entities, but we can talk about that later. It doesn't have a lot of bearing on my talk, at least for the time being. So in order to illustrate how scaffolding works, it's fairly simple, right? Imagine you have this beautiful path. There's a path, you can follow it. You are a deer in the woods, you have a path, you follow the path. It's all great. Someone did this path for you. You can use your environment. You have the affordances, everything. But what if you put this thing there? Suddenly your environment has been resignified, right? You have, in this process of scaffolding that you see here, the scaffolding that happens when paths are built and so on, suddenly changes, right? So this is what I'm going to be talking about from this point on. But let's just agree, again, that meaning is not reducible to material expressions. It's part of active behavior and available and open to organisms. This is the main point I want us to agree upon. And I think that for biosemioticians and people committed to biosemiotics, these are all fairly agreeable upon points. And let's also try to agree that scaffolding can be summarized as organisms being capable of relating to their environments by way of using sign relations. Sign relations are persistent and material makers of meaning that stay in the environment. And this is a crucial one, so let's go through it again. Sign relations are persistent and immaterial markers of meaning that stay in the environment. And I think this is really what makes Hofmeyerian scaffolding work. And these markers of meaning influence the way organisms behave. So scaffolding is not a passive thing that we've done. It's an active, causal sort of thing. We'll figure out what sort of thing it is in a bit. We don't really need to go too deep into the theory because most of you have read it, and those of you who haven't, well, you can just read this particular paper, the Semiotic Scaffolding Introduction from 2015, where he says, semiotic scaffolding is a tightly wound web of checks and balances, gradually establishing itself through myriads of semiotic interactions between organisms. Nature, in fact, is not so much about tooth and claw as it is about sensing, interpreting, coordinating, and social cooperation. So what is at stake here then? Non-physical, non-intentional causes for one. This is a big one. If you care about metaphysics in any degree, this is kind of a hard pill to swallow. Because how do we distinguish immaterial external causes from psychological or internal causes? Such as, for instance, mass psychosis. Uh-oh, that's kind of a problem. Not really. I mean, we do have a problem, but we can solve it by way of, say, you're a committed person, you go for cynicism, at least in the form in which Peirce establishes cynicism as the independence of ideas from their thinkers. Let's be careful with remembering that cynicism comes in two different flavors, at least. One is the continuity of mind and matter that makes mental properties establish themselves across non-mental or apparently non-mental entities, a gradualism of mental properties. That's one. The other one is the independence of thought from mental capacities in thinkers. That is, that ideas are independent from who thinks them. The second part is a much more Hegelian way of looking at Peirce, so it might depend on how much you've read Hegel in order to agree with that one. But I think that it's a bit more useful in this regard than talking about mental properties, at least when we talk about meaning making in the environment. So that's what's at stake. Now, I think we can agree more or less upon a bunch of those points, and that's basically why we're here, right? But let's talk about loss of meaning, about meaning that can, in fact, be destroyed. And let me start with the same kind of environmental relations, but let's make it easier. Let's make it for ourselves. I don't know if anyone of you have been to Slovakia besides Ludmila. This is a castle very close to Bratislava called Devin. So Devin has, this area has been populated since the Neolithic. There were Celts in the 5th century, and they started building this beautiful castle around the 9th century. Was finished built. The building finished in the 15th century, and then Napoleon went and kaboom, he blew it off to pieces. It's a beautiful area, nevertheless, really beautiful, worth visiting. And one thing that happens is that when you look at this old drawing of the area, you can see how the environment may have changed. There are some similarities there. We retain some kind of value in that environment, but more things happen. This was also used, the closer areas were used during the 20th century with residential buildings. Those buildings they look like this now, so we don't need to add much more, but we can see how this particular environment has had a bunch of different relations since the Neolithic. This is the same case for many other environments, certainly. You can find the same relations taking place in all sorts of environments. It's easier for us to think about those in human terms, but of course, this also happened for all sorts of living organisms, as long as we accept that living organisms in general do engage in some kind of meaning making of any sort. The one thing that we can say is that change doesn't change. Change is immutable. We keep facing change, environments keep facing change. And this is a normal part of being an environment. If you yourself are an environment, and as it turns out, we all are environments for other organisms, then we do change and we provide changes. The things we eat will change the way you're, the little bugs that you have in there are living. Some of them may not like what you're eating, So meaning comes and goes as specific environmental configurations change. For instance, it's common for certain environments to face some kinds of destructions. There's something to be said about forest fires, and I will talk about this in just slightly more detail, really, not a lot more, in a second. But it's normal for certain environments to engage in in their own destruction, so to speak, in order giving it, of course, an anthropomorphized language. Fires are a common thing in forest ecosystems, right? Forests require some fires, and they allow the replacement of certain amounts of biomass and so on. So change is important, and destruction is important too. Destruction of certain areas is going to be valuable for organisms and for environments as a whole. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to have change in general too, right? So if you're a committed Latmanian, you also have to think that, you know, the movement of texts across the semiosphere will provide their destruction eventually at some point, possibly. So what we saw in the previous examples was how environmental structures change. They don't cease being meaningful, but the value of their meaning has radically transformed. Let's take, for instance, the example of this fun little cat. If you're a cat and suddenly someone puts a phone pole or an electric pole there, now you have a new seat. You have something cool for your world. This is great for the cat. It's not something too useful for the people nor for the plants. The environment changes. This is a potentially positive example, right? The cat will transit through patches of green, but it will remain stationary on this pole. There's a sort of balance that we can strike in this case, but balance is not idyllic. There's interspecies cohabitation may lead to perceived, though not necessarily factual, issues, pointing to the fact that lived environments are value-laden. And there's this paper, Rats, Mice, and Humans, that some of you may have read by Pauline Delay, which I think goes into this in more detail. Is it 2 minutes if I don't take questions? Because I don't mind not taking questions. I don't mind not taking them, sorry. Okay, great. So the contention then is that if organisms create some kind of meaning, one of the main properties of said meaning is that it carries a kind of value. Now, this is the second part that I'm adding. This will be an added commitment to the metaphysical position of biosemiotics. That is that, let's say you're committed to science, I'm not, but whatever. Your science would also have a specific property that would be a kind of value that may be positive or negative depending on a number of factors. Positive and negative is, of course, a big, awful generalization. We are using it as a placeholder for more developed language or for a big paper that you may end up having to read at some point. Now, the process of the scaffolding is how those meanings become flipped, how a potentially positive in this reduction meaning becomes a negative meaning within an environment, any random environment. We already have the concept of semiocide that started with Varpura and that people like Yogi have mentioned quite a bit, and some of you have also engaged in talking about semiocide. Now, semiocide is a process of destruction, right, as we have conceptualized it, as a process of intentional destruction. But we know that there are non-intentional processes of destruction that are not just negligence in the destruction of environmental relations or in the destruction of certain ecosystems. The scaffolding is, I think, the more general way of framing this. It is the idea that meanings shift into negative values, meaning bearers degrade, impacting the environmental layer of meaning. And you can see how death, being a normal part of environments, will still have a certain removal of value. If you were, say, a squirrel, well, there are no squirrels. This is from the south of Chile, so there are no squirrels around there. It's too cold for them. And well, I don't know. There are no squirrels. That's the main point. But whatever may have inhabited that is not inhabiting it anymore, right? And it may have changed at some point. The death of a tree may signal something, may have some value, whatever. So physical destruction during disasters also erodes landscapes of meaning, both human and non-human. For non-verbal organisms, loss of environmental structures equals loss of guiding semiotic relations, such as affordances or cues. And remember that these affordances or cues are what we seem to be calling scaffolding. The destruction of those environments is what scaffolds the meanings. So the commitment is kind of big. We are committed to the existence of these environments, which for some might already be a big ask, but we're also committed to some non-physical entities existing that are what we call value, and that those also get destroyed. If they have some causal power, they can also be tackled or dealt with. The idea is that natural disasters, in particular, as an example of this, result in negative resignification. So former shelters become markers of danger and trauma. In 2023 and 2024, and this far in Chile, we had a series of, and we've had those for longer, we've had a series of cyclical fires that are not common. I don't know if you've been following the news from Spain and Portugal lately, that they're also undergoing radical destruction because of forest fires too. This happens in most Mediterranean areas. So as it turns out, Chile is also a Mediterranean area, and as such, it also faces the same challenges that other Mediterranean areas or with similar Mediterranean climate will face regarding forest fires. The dryness of the landscape, the certain kinds of biomass that exist there. What in this example, what you can see here is, I don't think I have a pointer, right? No, no pointer, no pointing. In the left, you have the before, and to the right, the after picture of what the environment looked like after the forest fires in 2023. But this goes beyond just the obvious transformation of the landscape. You can see it a bit more closer, and it should be seen and should be felt to some degree that the reports were awful, especially for the fires in 2023 or 2024, sorry, of people just shedding everything they had to save their dogs, and dogs panicking. The amount of people who died, the amount of cattle that died, it was ridiculous. And this also happens in the forest fires that are taking place right now in Spain and Portugal, particularly in the regions of Galicia and northern Portugal. So the point is that we see that these environments become transformed by ashes and so on, but though the fact that there's ashes covering the environment is a fairly negative thing. It has a negative kind of value, or whatever we want to call it. And I'm almost done. So basically, just again, to formalize things a little bit, the scaffolding can be further understood as the process by which meaningful relations change towards negative relations. That's for one. Markers of meaning become degraded. These markers of meaning cease to exist, and as a consequence, the environment drastically changes in its immaterial aspects. And this has really noxious consequences because it leads to reduced agency and increased lethality in those environments. Organisms cannot rely on familiar cues or affordances, and survival may depend on very rapid reconfiguration of meaning-making systems, as we are capable of doing that as symbolic agents. But non-symbolic agents may have a much harder time finding that. And take this with the cases of plants. After every cycle of fires, the destruction of forests leads to the increase in biomass of more flammable plants, and so on and so on. With each cycle, the amount of biomass is retained to a large degree. But the thing that grows is not the same thing that we had before, and it burns much faster. So the idea then of the talk is simply talking about a very simple concept, which is the scaffolding that I wanted to propose to have in mind, that processes of scaffolding, as beautiful as they may be seen, also have perhaps a negative component that we may not always pay attention to, at least in a formalized definition. And that's it. And we don't have a lot of time for questions, luckily. Alexei. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It can be enacted. You can create the scaffolding by eating poorly or smoking. I don't know. If you never smoked and suddenly you start smoking, it's gonna change you. Yes.
think that in the safe story, it's not physical entity, maybe it's real entity.
Mhm.
I mean, the ghost in the story
Yeah.
real, but not physical. When it comes to real, it's more about the meaning aspect, meaningful
Mhm.
aspect of the ghost, but it is not physical because you know when it comes to physical, it's
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We do not
I
disagree, but I think there's something to be said about the etiology of causes, whether we accept this devil as an actual devil, which I do not. So it's morally as an example,
yeah yeah yeah
mostly.
add to this scaffolding to then the scaffolding, you know, we see that there, when there scaffolding lead to more semiotic freedom, so with this scaffolding also lead to the loss of semiotic freedom.
I think it makes sense. It should lead to a loss of semiotic freedom, but sometimes we may need to degrade certain meaningful landscapes in order to create new ones. It's possible. But I'm speculating. I have no clue.
Thank you so much. Simply put, what is the benefit of the prefix D opposed to re?
Rescaffolding?
In so many of these
Mhm.
contexts, of course, it's changing, it's perpetually
Mhm.
changing. If I die, maybe that's descaffolding. For
Mhm.
me, for a maggot, it's fantastic.
Mhm.
Yes, we can all probably agree that extreme crises are a different category.
Mhm.
So let's say maybe even just in addressing climate crisis, in a purely pragmatic utilization sense, if we're trying to really address that with different agencies or on, what is the benefit of the valuation of D versus re and looking at it?
As a cyclical
Yeah.
thing.
I mean, both
I
theoretically, but also literally. I mean, if we're really trying to make changes.
well, I'm terrible at selling things, so I wouldn't know how to sell how to say whether it's better or not. But in terms of philosophically, at least, I believe that the scaffolding simply will give you a clearer picture. Rescaffolding already adds the cyclical component, right? I think that by having scaffolding and descaffolding, you're just painting a cleaner, a simple picture of the processes in which scaffolding exists. If you rescaffold, then you're assuming, for instance, that the biomass that exists will have maybe the same amount of value. Let me put it as an example. Say you have a forest with 27 species, it burns down, and then only two species survive, and they extend their biomass to the same point where the previous forest was there, and this forest burns again, and there's one species left. You could call it rescaffolding, but I would feel suspicious about calling it rescaffolding because we've seen a clear degradation in at least the quantity of possible sign relations that will exist within this particular environment. And that's what happens usually with forest fires, or at least the ones that I'm aware of in the Mediterranean areas. Sad.
So yeah, there can be more scaffolding and less scaffolding. This is actually the scale you are introducing here. So if there is too much scaffolding, this can also be negative.
Mhm.
So meaning making becomes too rigid,
Mhm.
so too channel. So therefore, somehow you stress somehow that de-scaffolding would be towards negative and scaffolding towards
Yeah,
positive.
we could make
So
a gradient.
so also descaffolding
Mhm.
is something like rejuvenation. So in ontogenetic terms, so old people become very scaffolded and rigid and thinking, but therefore we need young ones, which would be these
Not that young.
would be more creativity.
It could
That's
be,
an
yeah.
additional aspect, I think.
We could call it a gradient, but a gradient doesn't sound that fashionable as saying this scaffolding. Also, I figure. Don't know.
Thank
All
you
right.
very
Thank
much.
you.